Well, first, thank you very much for this invitation. I wish I could be with you in person. That's not possible yet, but hopefully within the year. I look forward to returning to Korea and seeing all my old friends, many of them at this event this morning. And a special thanks to KCCI and to my old friend Ute for inviting me. I look forward to this discussion, and frankly, I would like to get a better sense of Korea's thinking about the prospects of joining the CPTPP. And what I'd like to do over the coming 10 minutes or so is to kind of give you perspective from Washington, but also share with you some history and considerations with respect to Korea's considering joining the CPTPP. Okay, next slide. So I couldn't understand what was being said in the past 15 minutes, but I assume there was some background given on the CPTPP. I don't mean to spend a lot of time on this slide, but just to remind folks that at this point, there are 7 members of CPTPP. The other 4 have not ratified. Of the remaining 4, I continue to hear that Chile probably is the closest to ratifying, but all of them, for different reasons rooted in domestic politics, Malaysia, Peru, Chile, and Brunei have not proceeded with ratification. And this will become important when accession is contemplated, because the way I understand it, it is only the members that have ratified the agreement, that are parties to the agreement, actually form the consensus on accepting a country's accession. I would note that the current CPTPP agreement is largely the TPP agreement that was led by the United States. The market access commitments were kept intact. 22 rules provisions were suspended. Many of them, but not all of them, were issues important to the United States. And then I would just note that through exchanges of letters between different parties, other commitments were adjusted, in some points deleted or weakened. And here I would turn your attention to letters that Vietnam shared with respect to its commitments under the e-commerce chapter, and letters New Zealand needed in order to not have ISDS apply to them. And finally, the other provision I would draw your attention to is that there's no secretariat of the CPTPP. There's a repository, that's New Zealand, but every year a different CPTPP member assumes the secretariat functions, which in my mind means they'll have a say on accession procedures. This year, Japan is the serving as a secretariat. Next year, it's Singapore, and it goes in the order of the dates of ratification of the current 7 members. Next slide. So here's my take on Korean interest in TPP more than CPTPP. And here I would just note that in Washington, a lot of folks expected Korea to join around the same time that Japan joined. And folks were thinking that Korea was, a natural TPP partner in 2012, 2013. I will admit that I was always more skeptical, having worked closely with Korea on Chorus and bringing that into fruition, along with my good friend Suk-young Chae. And frankly, and I'd be interested in your views here, but for me, it seemed that the following issues contributed to Koreans' reluctance to join TPP. That included, frankly, fatigue with the United States. It was a time when the trade functions were moving from MOFAT to MOTI. There was a lot of focus on negotiating a free trade agreement with China, and that took priority. And there was a belief that Korea's current, at that point, that its bilateral FTA network was sufficient, and it was not convinced that it would gain more by joining TPP. In November 13th, when Seoul finally expressed formal interest in joining TPP, the United States at that point, and I was instrumental in those discussions, we came to the conclusion that it was just too late for us to welcome Korea into TPP. At that point, we thought we were very close to conclusion. In hindsight, conclusion was 2 years later, and I will admit that in hindsight, we should have supported Korea's entry because there would have been 2 years more to negotiate, but we really didn't know at that time. And it seemed that if we were going to conclude, including a new member like Korea would just delay the conclusion. And then for me, and again, I'd be interested in comments from my friends in Seoul, it seemed to me that renewed interest may be heightened with the conclusion of RCEP, and that's leading to consideration now of joining CPTPP and in our conference today. Next slide. So briefly, there are a number of possible CPTPP accession partners. I will say that when we completed TPP and the United States was still in, there was a long queue of countries that seemed very interested. Since the CPTPP has been concluded, however, accessions have not been, rapidly forthcoming. The United Kingdom now has formally announced interest in joining CPTPP, the first formal expression of interest. Excuse me. And my understanding is that a working party may be established as early as April. Thailand has for a number of years seemed on the brink of accession and has done a number of internal studies. Its deputy prime minister a couple of years ago visited Tokyo and said that they were all prepared to join, but Thailand has still not been able to make that formal decision yet. And then there have been, Taiwan seems quite interested. I don't think I need to go into the complexities of that accession, but I want to put that on the table. And the Philippines and Indonesia have at various times expressed interest, but knowing their trade regimes, I think this would be quite a stretch for them at this point. Now, interestingly enough, China's interest has escalated in the past year. And here I just have two quotes. First from Xi Jinping, that China will favorably consider joining the CPTPP. And then the adjective changed just last month with Premier Li Keqiang saying that China will actively consider joining the CPTPP. And my understanding is that China now is informally talking to certain CPTPP partners about prospects for accession. Next slide. So the other possible accession partner that people always ask for is the United States. And here, to be quite direct, I think this is unlikely in the near term, and possibly, for the medium term as well. Why do I say this? I have a quote from President Biden, and you're all probably aware of this stance that the United States, under the Biden administration, will only look at pursuing new trade deals after investments have been made in American workers and communities, after we get through COVID and associated economic recovery. TPP and CPTPP still remains politically toxic in the United States. It carries a lot of what we call baggage, and a lot of that is pretty negative. And then finally, as you probably have heard, and we can talk more about this in the question and answer period, but the Biden team is developing what they call a new worker-centric trade policy. And while the themes have been identified, I think it's going to take them some time to operationalize those themes into actual provisions in any trade initiative that they pursue. But with all that, I will say, and here's kind of the wild card, there is a real strong countering force, and there are folks within the administration who recognize the need to work with like-minded countries to develop an alternative economic model to state capitalism. And we'll have to see how these interests are balanced going forward. But for the the discussion of when Korea should join, I think if a recommendation or decision is made, let's wait for the United States, you may be waiting for a long time, at least a lot longer than 1 or 2 years. Next slide. So I'm not an expert in the CPT accession process. I will admit that in the past 24 hours, I have read through 3 pages of procedures that were agreed to in January 2019. I think the key for me is that prospective candidates are expected to be able to live up to all the CPTPP rules, as well as make high standard, comprehensive market access offers. In terms of procedures, in some ways this resembles the WTO in that a working group would be established that would include government representatives from each party, and any decisions on an accession candidate would need to be made by consensus. Again, my understanding that means consensus of the parties to the agreement, meaning at this current point, the 7 current members of CPTPP. Next slide. So as Korea contemplates the pros and cons of joining CPTPP, I wanted to kind of offer my views on the benefits of CPTPP accession for Korea. Number 1, I think that Korea would gain new market access, particularly to Japan and Mexico, with whom Korea currently does not have a bilateral FTA. I recognize that through RCEP, Japan and Korea are members. They have market access commitments between the 2 countries, as well as agreement on certain rules. But CPTPP, as we all know, goes way beyond RCEP, so this would be a lot more access to Japan, including in the agricultural market, where my understanding is Japan made a lot of, let's just say, provided limited market access under RCEP. Second, and I remember trying to have this discussion with my Korean colleagues when we were discussing CPTPP, is that it's not enough for Korea just to say, well, why do we need CPTPP or CPTPP? We have bilateral FTAs with the other partners, and at that point, including the US and other large markets. And I always pointed out that the market access commitments under CPTPP are much deeper and extensive than the market access commitments these countries have made in most bilateral FTAs, including those with Korea. By joining CPTPP, Korea would become part of this high standard FTA grouping, which frankly seems kind of natural to me, given that many of the CPTPP provisions still resemble the chorus provisions very closely. It would lead to further economic integration, trading partner diversification, and integration into CPTPP supply chains. And importantly, particularly if Korea is betting on other countries joining CPTPP, by entering CPTPP before these other candidates, Korea would have a voice and leverage with respect to following accessions. It would have a role in shaping new CPTPP rules. We call this a seat at the table. And frankly, this is an area that seems to resonate in the United States now when people talk about joining, the prospects of joining or not joining CPTPP or RCEP. This whole notion of not being at the table to shape the rules is a real loss. And finally, and I'm not going to go into any elaboration here, but we all know about potential geostrategic as well as macroeconomic benefits that have been detailed in certain studies that I know have been commissioned by the Korean government. So my last slide touches upon in deciding on whether to pursue CPTPP now or later, and under what conditions. These are some of the key considerations I think that Korea will need to consider. First, now that RCEP is completed, and I give congratulations to Korea here because I know Moti in particular was very active and very, provided a leadership role in taking RCEP over the finish line. But now that it's completed and more resources and attention are available, does CPTPP become more attractive? Does Korea want to become kind of part of this high standard FTA grouping? Second, there are Japan considerations, and I'm sure this will come up in remarks following mine. And this not only has to do with historical and political considerations, but also, and I've heard this, back when I was at USTR, the real concerns in Korea that Korea would lower its tariffs to Japan, let's just say from 8% on autos to 0. Japan has 0 tariffs on autos, but yet a lot of non-tariff measures, and would Korea be getting reciprocal access to Japan in particular? Third, there are China considerations, and there are a number of considerations here, including, does Korea think that China is really serious about accession? And if it is, does it make sense for Korea getting into the agreement first? Does it make sense for Korea to show after RCEP, which was concluded with China, to show the United States and other countries that it's also interested in joining groupings without China? So there are a number of, there are other China considerations here as well. A key question, and I'm sure this is what we'll get into as well in our discussion, it's the timing for a Korean accession. The accession procedures, as I understand it, contemplate that a working group could be established for, let's just say, one accession candidate, or perhaps for a group of accession candidates. And so with the UK, for example, expressing now interest in joining, should Korea consider joining with the UK? And maybe the accession would be quicker and easier than if you're part of a group. Or does it make more sense for Korea, let's say, to wait for the United States, even if this means indefinite, with the idea being that the United States could help vis-a-vis any potential problems with Japan during an accession procedure? And my last point would be, there are also substantive considerations, and that is how extensive and politically extensive would changes need to be made to Korea's current trade regime to live up to the market access and the rules, expectations of CPTPP partners. Here I would just flag agriculture, and here agriculture market access. For example, Korea has an exclusion for rice in our bilateral FTA, and I think in all of its other bilateral FTAs, I stand to be corrected. But in TPP, CPTPP, exclusions are not welcome. And even a country like Japan, and this was the last issue agreed to with Japan when we still were in TPP and we concluded it, and that was the quota for rice access. I would also highlight the SPS chapter, which is Chorus Plus, is an area of potential concerns for Korea. And finally, the state-owned enterprise chapter, although here I would draw Korea's attention to the fact that there are annexes for each country to that chapter where they can ask for transition periods or exclusions for certain state-owned enterprises. So with that, that kind of concludes my remarks. I look forward to the comments from the discussants and to having a really robust discussion about what I think is a really timely and important topic for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, so much for the wonderful presentation and insightful slides. Let us take 10 more minutes of your precious time because we have a bunch of gentlemen who are eager to ask you many questions, but we selected two gentlemen, Ambassador Choi Seok-young and Dr. Jung Chul from Kiev. So I give floor to Ambassador Choi.
Hi, Wendy. Good evening. I thank you very much for your comprehensive, the explanation of Korea and the CPTPP issues. In my personal view, there are two underlying considerations why Korea is considering to join the CPTPP at this point in time. Number one, there is a high speculation after the conclusion of RCEP negotiation that Korea might be rather more leaning to the Chinese side. Therefore, there is some motivation inside of Korean government that we have to make a kind of counterbalance. And it's a high time to consider joining CPTPP. And also, China also expressed its intention to consider joining CPTPP. Under that situation, why not Korea? That is the number one consideration. Second consideration is that although US may consider joining CPTPP at the later stage, but US may consider to reorganize the regional architecture, including CPTPP, then therefore Korea should be prepared before US move. That is my observation. And I have two comments and one question to you. The first comment is that the situation in 2012 and 13, why Korea did not actually catch the opportunity to join the TPP. I broadly agree with your observation, but I just would like to add some more points. After the entry into force of Korea-US FTA in March 15, 2012, actually our political capital was totally exhausted in the further liberalization because our stakeholders were fed up with negotiating with developed countries in opening our market more. Yeah? Then the situation was aggravated at the end of 2012. The power was shifted from Lee Myung-bak government to Park Geun-hye government. And then the trade ministry was moved from foreign ministry to the Modi side. And then Modi was not prepared to consider the trade negotiations actually comprehensively because they have to set up the organization first, but it took time. Therefore, the Modi expressed its interest to joining TPP later, actually around November 2013. Therefore, I mean, we had some very unfortunate situation in the year of 2012 and 13. And on top of that, US may have also hesitated in asking Korea to join the TPP. US did not ask us to join the TPP in stronger terms. Actually, that was also one of the elements. You may actually challenge me. That is my first comment. Second comment is that whether Korea should join the CPTPP together with the United States or without United States. In my view, Korea should join any trade agreement whatsoever, because Korea's dependency on trade is so high. Therefore, actually, we have to join the regional trade architecture. Therefore, I mean, joining the CPTPP is quite natural. And CPTPP is not only the commercial contract, but also it has also geopolitical considerations. But there are two challenges in Korea's joining to CPTPP. Number one is that the accession procedure, as you just mentioned, is not that much easy because the CPTPP's accession procedure is just like WTO accession procedure. The incumbent members have upper hand, and the exceeding countries actually as much as possible. And the existing members like Australia, New Zealand, or Canada would like to ask Korea for further concessions. For example, in agriculture, they continue actually asking Korea for the U.S. parity in the market opening in agriculture issues. That is number one challenge for the Korea joining CPTPP. And number two is that whether Korean domestic stakeholders are ready to accept Korean government possible decision to join the CPTPP. Because as I already mentioned here, I mean, we have to make further concession in agriculture and SOE or digital trade or SPS in several other areas. Then and then also the Korea is facing a series of political elections this year and next year, and political populism is high on agenda items in our politics here. Then whether we have sufficient political capital to overcome these challenges. That is my comment. But I mean, where there is a political will, then we can overcome all these kind of challenges. Actually, in my view, that is the two comments. And I have a last question. I will be very brief. As Japan issues, as we already know, actually, the Korea-Japan relations are very much strained, and that is not helpful for actually Korea to join the CPTPP. Japan. I'm not sure whether Japan is supportive that Korea would join the CPTPP. And I just would like to ask you the role of the United States for asking Korea to join the CPTPP. U.S. New administration already declared that it will work with the allies on the basis of the agreed rules. Yeah? And the CPTPP is not necessarily a kind of a commercial contract among participating members. Therefore, Korea's accession to CPTPP is also the interest of the United States, actually forming new supply chains in these areas. Therefore, to what extent U.S. can play constructive role for Korea to joining the CPTPP. You just mentioned the Korea's high tariff and Japanese non-tariff barriers. There is imbalance between them. Therefore, it's very difficult technically to strike the balance. But there is a certain role the U.S. can play to persuade Japan and also to encourage Korea to join the CPTPP. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Choi. Let me ask Dr. Jang Chol for the second question.
Hi, Wendy. Yeah, it's very good to see you. Hi. I have prepared about 10-minute comments, but for the interest of time, I'll just go directly to my questions. You know, the U.S. already made the USMCA, and you mentioned that it's going to be a long shot for the U.S. coming back to CPTPP. So even if the U.S. come back to the TPP or CPTPP, what would you think about what area would you think the U.S. would like to upgrade in the CPTPP? And you also mentioned that the Biden administration, the trade policy is worker-centric trade policy, and also we know that the U.S. priority would be on the labor and environment. So we know that there are going to be some areas like the digital and the country of origin like that. So I think when it comes to the new sort of the trade agreement, if the U.S. tries to engage in, which area would be the ones that U.S. would like to upgrade? And Biden administration also talks about the global democracy summit. So it seems like the U.S.-China competition will become more severe. But now, in the APEC, the FTAP talks are actually coming back. So as you played as U.S. SOM for many years in APEC, would you think that the FTAP could be a sort of the possible resolution for the U.S.-China coming together in a sense? Yeah, that's my question.
Wendy, you have the floor.
Okay, well, those are all easy questions, but it's so good to see my friends and to have this discussion. So, Ambassador Che has asked the question of what role could the US play if Korea was interested in joining the CPTPP. I assume the question was based on the US not being a member of the CPTPP, but still, having an important role with respect to Korea and Japan. I mean, frankly, if we're not a member, our ability to influence and encourage specific things to be done is pretty limited in my view. But I do think overall, and we've already seen this, is that the White House is going to play a role in trying to get Korea and Japan on, a better footing, based on the view that it's critical at this time that two of our closest allies find a way to work together and to look forward, agree on a forward-leaning agenda and identify issues that they can work on together. So I think in that spirit, the US can play a role. But the notion that, we would get involved, in talking about different commitments, I just don't see that. I don't think it's on our radar screen. I think from a general point of view, I would suspect that the Biden administration would welcome Korea joining the CPTPP. I couldn't say that about the Trump administration because I think they hated CPTPP so much that they wouldn't want anyone to join it. I think the Biden team recognizes that, there would be a lot of benefits, geostrategic benefits for Korea joining. So I think they could play a role, but it would be a role at a much higher level than actually getting involved in, specific provisions and pleading Korea's case to Japan and to others. So that's, my first response. With respect to this worker-centric trade policy, I mean, in my view, this is a work in progress. Some of you may have already read the report issued by Carnegie about a year ago now about foreign policy for the middle class. And this was a project that was kind of initiated by Jake Sullivan. And I happen to be part of the task force for this group, about 10 of us or 8 of us, and, was instrumental, made, input into the trade section in particular. And I think if you haven't read it, I would really recommend you look at the, at least read the executive summary and the conclusion. But I think it will give you a sense of where the White House is coming on trade policy. Based on what I've heard and seen so far, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, is playing a role on trade policy. Trade policy is going to become an integral part of not only domestic policy, but foreign policy. And I think we're going to see that more and more. When Catherine Tai talks about a worker-centric trade policy, she emphasizes the need to align our trade agenda with the domestic priorities of the Biden administration, including COVID recovery, economic recovery, and improving not just creating jobs for workers, but high-paying jobs, improving kind of the dignity of the workforce, and spreading benefits to these communities, with workers. Now, all this needs to be operationalized. And, what does this really mean in terms of, I think that was my friend Chul Chung's question, like, what does this mean in terms of, what the US might ask in any trade agreement, including if it were to rejoin the CPTPP, what it would mean in terms of revisions, deletions even, and updates to the CPTPP. And I can't answer that question with any confidence, because I think, I don't even think USTR knows at this point what that actually means. But kind of based on my experience, number one, I think, based on my experience, and also based on, and I would encourage everyone interested in this to really look at the differences between CPTPP and the USMCA. There are a lot of similarities in many chapters, but there are also some important differences. And so I think that is a good place to start. But again, I'd emphasize the word start. I don't think that is the template as is. So in terms of deletions, I would suspect that the United States would not be pushing for robust investment chapters anymore. I think investment will be viewed by the Biden administration in many ways like it was viewed by the Trump administration, and that is offshoring of jobs. And, Lighthizer always felt, why should I make things easier for our companies investing outside the United States? They should seek their own protections. And so I would be surprised if the United States were to advocate for ISDS, looking ahead with respect to trade agreements. I also think the area of government procurement, there will be similarities between Trump's approach in the USMCA and what we would seek in trade agreements going forward. And that is not more government procurement, but actually less government procurement and an ability to use our Buy America regulations and laws more robustly. I think so those would be kind of two areas where I think we would not push as hard for. And I would add probably pharmaceuticals here, both with respect to possibly transparency, but also with respect to, many of the IPR provisions. I'm not saying pharmaceuticals would go away, but I don't think it will be a priority. In terms of new issues, I think, we would see more asks with respect to environment and to labor. But I don't think it will stop there. And I think, let's be honest, CPTPP is pretty ambitious provisions in both areas, in both chapters. They both include enforceable provisions. But since then, there are more robust provisions in the USMCA in both of those chapters. And I would suspect even more would be added in those chapters beyond USMCA. I would suspect the administration would ask for enforceable currency manipulation provisions. There are probably other areas with respect to stricter rules of origin, with higher regional value content requirements, I think would be on the plate as well. But those are just some of the provisions and updates. And this is where I think it's going to get tricky for the United States to re-enter CPTPP if it really was serious about it. And just, I don't know, last September, under the Asia Society, I issued a paper on CPTPP and looking forward and what this would mean. And as part of that, I interviewed a range of current and former TPP officials in most of the TPP countries. And what I heard from most of them was, A, we would love the United States back. B, we're willing to make some changes. We recognize that we would need to as a price to get the United States back in. But 3, we don't have an open checkbook here, that we would want the United States to be very targeted and selective about the changes it would be seeking, that we would have a limited bandwidth. And I would say 4, and this is a real concern of mine, because I've had these debates with certain people that they say, oh, after the midterm election, that the United States might, really then be interested in joining CPTPP. And, I'm a little skeptical about other TPP partners in the last 2 years of a Biden administration making major concessions to the United States to get us back in, without any certainty about who may be in the White House 2 years beyond that. So, and I hate to say it, but if you were to ask me, I think there would be a stronger prospect of the United States rejoining, a CPTPP, in, 2.0, an improved CPTPP in a second term, either for Biden or the Democrats, versus, if the White House went the other way. I think it gets very difficult after the midterm election. And I haven't even mentioned, where TPA stands. And so with respect to the last question on FTAP, I mean, I'm very skeptical about that, because remember, FTAP means it's an APEC idea. And to me, that means that China and Russia would be part of this agreement. Look, it'd be great if the day would come where the United States and China and others could all agree on a free trade agreement. But my view is we're going further and further away from that prospect, particularly given as the state sector in China becomes all the more extensive, and the private sector, in China is becoming increasingly subject to state input and influence. So yeah, I don't see that happening, not even as a long-term vision. I would say it's even hard for me to seriously look at FTAP, with that lens.
Thank you, Andy, for your kind answers. You have been a good friend of Korea, and I know you will always support Korea in joining CPTPP. We have taken too much of your time already, so I had to say goodbye to you at this moment. So we will see soon when this is all over. Take care.
Okay, thank you. Bye. Have a great day, everyone.